Humans, without a doubt the smartest animal on Earth. Yet we're unmistakably tied to our ape origins. Millions of years ago, we were apes living ape lives in Africa. So how did we get from that to this? What happened? What set us on the path to humanity? The questions are huge, but at last, there are answers. More than 6 million years ago, we took that first step to separate from the apes.
We see the launching of the career that ultimately led to Homo sapiens.
And 3 million years ago, we see the roots of our big brain begin to take hold in a tiny creature, more like a chimp than a human.
The frontier of human evolution is really being brought to this razor-sharp edge.
And we now know that for millions of years, many different human-like species lived together on the planet, until one day, there was only us. Homo sapiens, the most complex, adaptable animal on Earth. So how did we get this way, and why? A radical new theory reveals how episodes of cataclysmic change forced our ancestors to adapt or die. Millions of years ago, on the plains of Africa, a momentous event took place. Apes that had walked on 4 legs stood up and walked on 2. Eventually, this change in posture would be followed by a change in their brains. Somehow, over time, they would become us. We know it happened, but we've never known when or why. Until now. In the Sahara Desert, a 6 million-year-old fossil called Tumai may hold the secret of how we first walked upright.
We are writing the first chapter of human evolution. We are very close to the beginning. Very close.
And the fossilized bones of a child from 3.5 million years ago hint to us about the beginnings of human thought. We're discovering how many different human species lived on Earth at the same time, and why all but one died out. We, Homo sapiens, are the first ever to be alone. So what powered our evolution? Why did we become human? Scientists are scouring the most remote parts of Africa for clues. The search for answers begins here, in the Afar, northeastern Ethiopia. It's part of the Great Rift Valley, a deep cut in the earth where geologic forces are ripping Africa apart. Millions of years of history are brought to the surface in layers of exposed rock. It's hot and desolate. Dangerous too. Ancient rivalries and modern weapons have turned the Afar into a no-man's land of simmering conflict. But Zerai Alemzaget has made this forbidding place his life's work. He's searching for the fossilized traces of our earliest human ancestors. The fossil bones of animals like antelopes, elephants, and pigs are abundant. But the fossils of our ancestors are extremely rare. Then, in a stroke of luck, Zerai makes the find of a lifetime. A find that illuminates our origins in a unique way.
On that afternoon, we decided to survey this hillside. And the first thing that was spotted was a cheekbone of the face.
It was a face so tiny, it had to be a baby. But not a baby chimp. He could tell that from its shape. The skull was embedded in sandstone, but as Zerai turned it over, he could see more bones inside.
Everything was squashed against the base of the skull and completely covered by sandstone block.
Clues to the age of the fossil came from a distinctive feature in the landscape: white bands of volcanic ash.
And that is the volcanic ash dated to 3.4 million years ago.
If the volcanic ash is 3.4 million years old, Zerai's fossil, which was lying just above it, must be younger. It was a child from the dawn of human evolution, about 3.3 million years ago. Zerai called the baby Salam, the Ethiopian word for peace. What were Salam and her family like? What kind of world did they live in? The answers are hidden in their fossil bones. Zerai has brought his precious fossil here to the National Museum. His challenge is to release her from the tomb of sandstone in which her bones are encased. He quickly identifies her. She's from a species considered by most scientists to be an ancient ancestor. Australopithecus afarensis, a small chimp-like creature who walked on two legs. This is the same species as the famous Lucy, discovered in the 1970s by Don Johanson.
Lucy was terribly important because she was really an amalgam and of different characteristics of ape and human.
I think specimens like Salam and Lucy are extraordinary simply because you can look at them and see evolution in the making.
But seeing evolution in the making will take some work. Salam's fossilized bones are solid rock, held together by a mesh of soft sandstone. It has to be painstakingly removed.
You spend hours and hours and days and years, and that removes the sand grains, grain by grain, working every day.
He's been at it for 8 long years, but the payoff has been amazing. As the work progressed, Zerai revealed an almost complete skull. And tucked beneath it was nearly her entire spine, along with both shoulder blades. Other bones were found nearby.
An almost complete foot. This is the kneecap. The tibia here.
Never before had a child's skeleton been found so ancient and so complete. Her bones would fit in a shoebox, but they speak volumes about her life. For example, to find out how old she was when she died, Zerai looked at her teeth, but not the baby teeth visible in her jaw. The adult teeth growing inside the bone, as seen in a CT scan. From that, we know Salam died at age 3. Other bones confirm that Lucy walked on 2 legs, like us.
This is Lucy's pelvis, and you can see how different a chimpanzee is, and the reorientation of these hip bones. In a chimp, they're facing straight forward. So this is what everybody's sitting on in their living room right now. So they're not identical, but clearly these two resemble each other much more closely, right? then either one of these resembles the pelvis of an ape.
Millions of years ago, long before Salam and Lucy, Africa was a wet tropical environment covered with rainforest. This is where the ancestors of Salam and Lucy lived. They probably looked a lot like chimps. But then Africa started to gradually dry out. The rainforest began to shrink. A million years ago, the Rift Valley was a patchwork of grassy plains, scattered woodlands, lakes, and rivers.
Definitely very different from what we see here today. Wow, a nice pig here.
As their environment changed, scientists believe our ancestors changed too. When Lucy's kind were first discovered, many people thought they were the so-called missing link between apes and humans. But the science of genetics has transformed our understanding with a technique called the molecular clock. Today, scientists can compare DNA from closely related species to find out how long ago they split from a common ancestor.
It's just a very simple idea that the rate of change in DNA sequences is more or less constant over time. And that's an extraordinarily powerful concept because it means that you have a way of determining when two species last shared a common ancestor.
Living forms evolve because DNA sometimes spontaneously changes as it copies itself. These changes happen at a surprisingly regular rate. By counting the differences between the genetic code of chimps and humans, we can calculate how long they've been evolving away from each other.
The dates that one almost always gets are around 5 to 7 million years ago for when humans and chimpanzees last shared a common ancestor.
Here was proof that humans diverged from the apes much earlier than we thought, about 6 million years ago. It shows Lucy and Salam weren't one step removed from chimps, but many. They may even be closer to us than to the first human ancestor. So what came before Lucy and Salam? Who was our earliest ancestor?
Decided to go to Africa, but to the west. To the west of the Great Rift.
1,600 miles to the west, at the edge of the Sahara Desert in northern Chad.
Obviously, if you only go to the field in East Africa, then you are going to find fossils only in East Africa. This was the situation.
Michel was looking in a place where the few animal fossils he turned up were all around 6 million years old. No one expected any human-like fossils to be found in a layer that ancient.
And everyone said, no, there just aren't any fossils there.
Michel was not to be deterred. He was stubborn, many thought to the point of madness. He and his team spent years searching the desert for signs of our ancestors, and year after year, they came up empty. Then, on their 26th expedition in 2001, they found a smashed, misshapen skull around 6 million years old. They called it Sahelanthropus chidensis. There were no bones apart from the skull. Could it be a human ancestor or just another ape? The skull was so deformed, it was difficult to tell. Michel would have to reconstruct it. His first step was to take the skull, now nicknamed Toumaï, to a particle accelerator in Grenoble, France, to use its powerful X-ray scanner. Over 1,000 pictures of the fossil were taken to build a 3D image of the crushed skull. Using the virtual image, the skull could be restored to its original shape. It was then reproduced by a type of 3D printer equipped with lasers which hardened plastic. When it finally rose from its bath, the cast of Toumaï's skull was ready for detailed study. The cast allows Michel to answer an important question. Did this ancient creature walk on two legs millions of years before Lucy or Salam? It's how the skull connects to the spine that provides the vital clue. And Michel could infer that from the shape of Toumaï's skull. If Toumaï's skull is set on the neck of an ape that walks on all fours, his eyes point downward. That can't be right. Set on the upright spine of a biped, his eyes point straight ahead. For Michel, this proved Toumaï walked upright. One key difference between humans and apes is the length of childhood. But what do we know about the childhood of our early ancestors?
We know all about the adult individuals, but we didn't know much about the children.
The brains of baby chimps have an early growth spurt. They're almost fully formed by age 3. In humans, that growth spurt is slower, and it takes nearly 2 decades for our brains to fully mature. But what about Salam's brain 3.3 million years ago?
That's, of course, most exciting.
Her skull tells us all we need to know.
At this place.
We have her milk teeth and her adult teeth, which give us her age, 3 years old. And we have a cast of the inside of her skull, which tells us about her brain.
When you have this, you can directly measure how much of the brain was formed at age 3.
From other fossils, we know how large Salam's brain would have been as an adult. So Zerai could calculate how much of her brain was already formed by age 3 when she died. He knows what the answer would be for a chimp.
By age 3, a chimpanzee would have over 90% of the brain formed.
But Salam's brain was only around 75% of its adult size, suggesting it was growing up slower. But is there any other evidence Salam's brain was becoming more human and less ape? To find out, compare a human brain to a chimp's.
This is the brain of our closest relative, the chimpanzee brain. Slightly larger than you would expect of a typical primate for their body size, not greatly so. But there's a difference.
Scientists look for clues to the evolution of the brain in the folds and furrows on its surface. One important structure is called the lunate sulcus.
In chimpanzees, as in many primates, there's this big, deep sulcus here, the lunate sulcus.
The lunate sulcus is a deep furrow in a primate's brain. It divides parts of the brain related to vision from the rest of the neocortex, which is where more complex thought happens. The human brain doesn't have this deep furrow, and the neocortex is bigger than the vision structures, which have moved far to the back. So did Salam have the deep furrow and small neocortex of a chimp, or had something changed? Brains don't fossilize, but her remarkably complete skull provides a way to see some of the different structures of her brain. A cast of the brain case, called an endocast, preserves the impression of the brain's surface. Ralph Holloway has a collection of 300 brain endocasts from many of our ancestors.
What a paleoneurologist like myself will be looking for are those indications on the endocast that might suggest reorganization taking place. And that's why things like the so-called infamous lunate sulcus becomes important.
Ralph claims that as chimp-like ancestors evolved into creatures like Salam and Lucy, the lunate sulcus, the furrow marking the vision structures, moved back, making room for a larger neocortex, the thinking part of the brain.
If you look carefully, what you've got here is a depression that could very likely be the lunate sulcus. And so that suggests then by Australopithecine times that you're having a beast that is simply smarter than present-day chimpanzees.
It's a time still shrouded in mystery. For almost 500,000 years, the fossil record is virtually silent. But in this blank period, something is happening. In 2.5 million-year-old layers, scientists begin to find something new. We might be tempted to call them rocks, but someone was shaping them. They are the first stone tools.
The way we know this is a tool instead of just a broken rock is that it's broken in a very particular way, breaking a flake off this way, this way, back and forth. So there is a method behind how this rock was broken in order to make it into a tool, and it's not a random method.
Finally, the skulls of a new creature begin to turn up. Is this the toolmaker? The skulls are different from what came before. They represent the dawn of a new era, beginning around 2 million years ago. This is our era, the era of the genus Homo, humans. The mysterious toolmaker, Homo habilis, is the first of these new creatures.
We definitely have evidence that the stone tools were being used to break the long bones in order to get to the marrow inside the long bones. There were clear cut marks on the bones of turtles, crocodiles, big antelopes, little antelopes, even hippos, really big animals like hippos. So we know that meat had become a new important part of the diet of Homo habilis.
The first fossil to be called Homo habilis included 21 bones of the hand and was nicknamed Handyman.
This little bone is the bone at the end of the thumb. And that little bone in Homo habilis, like in humans, is very broad. And the broad bone reflects having a broad pad on the thumb with a lot of surface area for fine precision grip.
With newly dexterous hands, this creature could make better tools. But what was it like? The few skeletal bones that have been found indicate a creature much smaller than us, about the same size as Lucy and Salam's kind, Australopithecus, 3 to 4 feet tall. Homo habilis was still ape-like in many ways, but with a critical difference.
What we see in the evolution of Homo habilis is an expansion in the brain size compared to Australopithecus. So here is the skull of Australopithecus, and it has no forehead. It just has a straight slope behind the orbits. Whereas here in Homo habilis, you see a sloping, elevated forehead. And in Australopithecus, the area behind the orbits is pinched in, also reflecting a small frontal region. In contrast, in Homo habilis, we see an expansion of that area behind the orbits that points to an expansion in the cognitive capabilities of higher functions, of higher reasoning functions of the brain.
It was an expansion equivalent to a doubling of brain volume. Gone is the projecting snout of an ape. In Homo habilis, the face of humanity is emerging. Africa was also home to many other human-like species. Climate instability put pressure on all of them.
So there are these time periods when African climate was really unstable. So anything that was living there at the time would have had to adapt to really dramatically different climate changes.
Those that couldn't adapt died out, like Salam and Lucy's kind. Better problem solvers, like Homo habilis, survived. Two million years ago, these spectacular plains and canyons witnessed a mysterious event. The birth of the first ancestor we can really call human. New discoveries are revealing a creature surprisingly like us. A world traveler, a toolmaker, a hunter, tamer of fire, creator of the first human societies. Amazingly, the qualities that make us human began not with our own species, Homo sapiens. The true birth of humanity began much further back in time, millions of years ago. Then do we encounter our ancestor, Homo erectus, in Africa's Great Rift Valley. About 2 million years ago, new creatures appeared with abilities never seen before in the animal kingdom. Meet Homo erectus, a toolmaker and hunter. One of the first members of our genus, the genus Homo, humans.
The transition to Homo was probably one of the most important transformations that occurred in human evolution.
Arms got thinner, legs got longer, brains got bigger. It was a huge evolutionary step from ape bodies to bodies like ours. And here they are, the actual bones of a human ancestor who lived over 1.5 million years ago. It's the earliest human skeleton ever discovered. The Leakeys called him Turkana Boy. His bones have revolutionized our understanding of the transition from ape to human.
The really important thing about Turkana Boy is how complete he is. We've got arms and legs and bits of his spine and his ribs. And usually when we find these things, we get very excited about one little bit of bone. But that little bit can't tell us very much about an individual. So having a nearly complete skeleton, we can start to ask big questions.
The first big question was, what did he look like? His skeleton tells us he was 5 feet 3 inches tall, with a build closer to a man's than an ape's. But how close? Paleo artist Victor Dieck specializes in painting and sculpting our human ancestors with precise anatomical accuracy. Victor's going to add Turkana Boy to his family of ancient faces.
At this stage of the game, I know that Turkana Boy is not an ape. He is a very early true human. And so here we have a modern human skull. The faces are very similar to one another, but Turkana Boy's skull is a bit more primitive and has a lower forehead and a much smaller brain capacity.
Now, for the first time in 1.5 million years, here he is, our ancestor, the Homo erectus, called Turkana Boy. But what he looked like is only the beginning of his story. To reconstruct his life, we need to find out how old he was.
And if we look at his skeleton, we can see that the growth plates on his limbs that would fuse when he's fully adult are all unfused. So even though he's very tall, we know that he's still growing.
The fact that Turkana Boy was not fully grown has turned out to be a boon to researchers.
You can answer questions like, did the boy grow up like a modern human? Or did he grow up more like an ape?
Turkana Boy was already 5 feet 3 inches tall.
When scientists compared his bones and teeth to ours, he seemed to be about 14 years old. But when dental specialist Chris Dean began to study his teeth, he was in for a shock. It turns out that all teeth, fossil or not, preserve a remarkably precise record of childhood.
This is a fossil tooth, and we can see the enamel cap, which covers the core of the tooth, which is made of dentine. Dentine is just another word for ivory. And within the enamel, you can see the rods, which are running from the enamel-dentine junction here out to the surface of the tooth.
Enamel has a regular growth pattern like the rings of a tree. Under an electron microscope, it looks like rods made of tiny beads.
Each of the little beads along these prisms represent one day's growth, because the cells which produce enamel are actually under the influence of a circadian or daily clock. And those secretions during the day speed up and then slow down, and there's a permanent record of that in every tooth. So you can see rods running all the way through this tissue, and every day along the rod there is a wobble where the tissue slows down and then speeds up.
So if you count the beads in these strings, you can figure out exactly how many days that tooth has been growing. When Chris looked at the fossilized teeth of Turkana Boy, he got a huge surprise. Turkana Boy wasn't 14 years old, he was 8.
What that implies is that the growth of the Turkana boy resembled more closely that of chimpanzees today.
To be 5'3" at age 8, Turkana Boy must have grown up very fast, at a rate closer to chimps than us. Here was a slow-moving creature with no claws or fangs, easy prey for the hungry predators around him.
This is a fossil forehead and brow ridge of a Homo erectus. And on the brow ridge, you can see the bite mark of a carnivore. Well, this reminds us that these Homo erectus individuals weren't at the top of the food chain.
So how did Turkana Boy, a weakling with a big brain which needed calories, get his meat?
Homo erectus faced a problem. How do you kill a big dangerous animal that has lots of meat and fat in it without that animal also killing you?
I think the answer to that was a very clever set of innovations, and that is endurance running and high activity in the middle of the day.
The ancestors of Homo erectus, small hairy apes like Lucy, were bipedal but probably didn't do much running. But Turkana Boy's kind were built to run, like us.
This is an accelerometer. It weighs
Dan Lieberman believes they could run long distances because, like us, they had lost their thick coat of body hair and could keep cool by sweating. This was the key to their success. But how do we know if these crucial changes go back all the way to Turkana Boy's time, over 1 million years ago? Skin and hair are rarely preserved in the fossil record. So to find out, we have to look to a creature that's been intimately connected with hair for a long time, the louse.
All animals seem to have some type of lice that parasitize them. Mammals have them, birds have them, even fish have types of lice. But most other creatures have only one type of lice that parasitize them.
Humans have one kind of louse on their heads and another in the pubic area. Geneticist Mark Stoneking asked himself why.
The answer that seems obvious is that when we had body hair all over our bodies, we had one type of lice until we only had hair on our heads and in our pubic region. And so therefore you would have this hairless geographic barrier to contact between the two.
Mark was surprised to find out that the human pubic louse is very different from the human head louse. Somehow, in the past, it seems to have come from gorillas.
Because the pubic lice is actually more closely related to gorilla lice. Now, how it is our ancestors got pubic lice from gorillas, I wouldn't care to speculate. But nonetheless, one needs gorilla lice in order to really work this whole thing out.
The most likely scenario is that when we lost our body hair, the original human louse migrated to our heads, leaving the pubic area temporarily unpopulated by lice. When our ancestors had contact with gorillas, perhaps sleeping in their nests or scavenging their bodies for meat, the gorilla louse colonized their pubic region. Eventually, it turned into the human pubic louse of today. So if we could find out when the human pubic louse and the gorilla louse diverged, we would have a rough idea of when we lost our body hair. Fortunately, there's a way to figure that out. The genetic dating technique known as the molecular clock. It's based on the fact that the sequence of chemical bases which make up DNA mutate at a regular rate.
It's just a very simple idea that the rate of change in DNA sequences is more or less constant over time. And that means that you have a way of determining when two species last shared a common ancestor.
By counting the number of differences in the genetic code of two species, scientists can determine how long they've been evolving away from each other. When Mark used the molecular clock to count the differences between the DNA of gorilla lice and human pubic lice, he came up with a date for their divergence.
The estimated date for the divergence is roughly 3 million years ago.
That means long before Turkana, maybe even around Lucy's time, our ancestors had slowly begun to lose their body hair. Turkana was mostly hairless, just like us. Something unprecedented in our evolution. Building fires and cooking.
The Homo erectus, the first species that looks like us. And I think only cooking can explain the magnitude of this change.
The earliest evidence that our ancestors deliberately used fire for cooking dates to long after Turkana's time. But Richard Wrangham is sure Homo erectus was building fires much earlier.
Now, for the first time, we had a species that was committed to living on the ground because they lose their climbing adaptations. Well, how were they sleeping? They had to be able to protect themselves from wild animals.
On the African savanna, full of predators who hunt by night, Richard believes Turkana and his people couldn't have survived without fire. And he thinks only cooking, which makes food more soft and digestible, can explain why Homo erectus evolved smaller teeth and a much smaller gut.
These things are compatible with the reduced cost of digestion produced by cooking food. Nothing else is.
As our ancestors reaped the benefits of cooking, something else happened too, at least according to Wrangham. We became more social.
Humans have this wonderfully calm temperament compared to chimpanzees, say. Where did it come from? We were drawn to a common place, the fireplace.
Wrangham believes we learned to share and communicate, sitting around fires, waiting for food to cook. It's speculative, but one thing is for sure. In the Homo erectus world, new social relationships had to be evolving. The bonds between mothers and children must have been very different from the apes. The instinct to look after each other. And it helps us imagine Turkana's final day on Earth. In the animator's scenario, he starts the day out on a hunt. But he has trouble keeping up with the hunting party. Why? The evidence from his skeleton is that he was sick and in pain at the time he died.
If we look at his lower jaw, we can see right here under the teeth that we've got a bit of an abscess and an infection. That kind of an infection could have entered the rest of his body, could have killed him.
An abscess that ate away that much of his jawbone would have been agonizing. Turkana boy is in so much pain, he's unable to continue the hunt. Knowing he would be looked after, perhaps he returned to his campsite to find comfort among the females.
I think he was probably a miserable fellow, in a lot of pain and very dependent on support and handouts. So it was a species that already felt that he's one of our weaklings that, you know, we love and must protect and care for to have got him that far.
But however much they may have wanted to help him, there was nothing they could do about the infection that was probably spreading through his body.
From what the evidence suggests, I just always imagined him not knowing what was wrong with him. And there's a sadness to it. But ultimately from that comes this immortal being.
His skeleton was so complete, it is likely he died in water, which would have protected him.
It's very unusual to get a skeleton because normally these things are eaten by carnivores. And in this case, it seems that the boy's body was washed into a swamp, and so the carnivores never saw it and never destroyed it. And it gradually decomposed, and as the rivers flooded, brought in more sediment, buried it. And you could see footprints of hippos that had walked all over the bones, and some of the ribs and things were standing vertically instead of lying flat on the ground. And you could sort of reconstruct the situation and how the boy, what had happened after he died and why he was complete. It really was an amazing experience to see it.
For almost 2 million years, his bones were preserved by the earth. Their discovery opened a window for us on an unknown world. The world of the most successful human ancestor of all time, Homo erectus. They've revealed to us that mysterious moment when almost everything human was born. Our bodies, our minds, our emotions. Think of all we've become. Trace the threads of our origins through the ancestors who went before. They all lead back to Turkana boy and his kind, the first humans. It was probably Homo erectus, almost 2 million years ago, who first started to leave Africa. Ever since, Africa has been the engine of our evolution, pumping out wave after wave ancient humans who populated Europe and Asia. Settling in far-off places, they developed in their own special ways. Soon after, another wave left Africa, this time heading for Europe. This was the species that would one day give rise to the Neanderthals. Ever since the first skull was discovered in Heidelberg, Germany, they have been called Homo heidelbergensis.
500,000 years ago, in these European populations, there was planning, there was consciousness, there was a human mind, and there was also symbolic behavior.
Homo heidelbergensis would continue to evolve, eventually becoming the species who would populate Europe, the Neanderthals. Of all ancient humans, the Neanderthals were the closest to us. Their brains were slightly larger than ours. Their short, heavy-set bodies helped them survive repeated ice ages. They were hunters, living off the big game that roamed the edges of the great ice sheets covering Europe and Central Asia. Today, the remains of a young boy who died 100,000 years ago are helping researchers penetrate the mysteries of the Neanderthal mind. the Meuse Valley in Belgium. It was caves and rock shelters here that gave up the very first Neanderthal fossils 150 years ago. Today, they are revealing deeper secrets of the Neanderthal world. For over 20 years, Michel Toussaint and Dominique Bonjean have been excavating a cave called Skladina. One millimeter at a time, they've been sifting through the debris that once filled the cave. Their painstaking work paid off.
I've had the chance to be present when one of my students have discovered the Neanderthal child. And when we have come there and see that this piece was, we were so surprised, we couldn't believe.
What they uncovered was the jawbone of a young boy, 100,000 years old. Nearby, they found more fragments and teeth, until they had almost a complete mouth. Since then, they've been trying to reconstruct the life of the boy from Skladina. They know Michel is taking a piece of the jaw to one of the few places in the world where the tests he needs can be done. The Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Germany, is one of the world's foremost centers for human evolutionary studies. Here, the jawbone of the child from Skladina is put through a high-powered CT scan. This allows researchers to peer into the internal structure of the teeth and bone.
So this is the mandible that was scanned yesterday, the Skladina mandible. And we have built up what we call a surface model, which is basically a virtual representation of the mandible in a computer. We can separate all the teeth from the bone in the specimen. The features that we can explore show us how Neanderthal are similar to us in many aspects, but also how they are different.
The teeth of children are among the most prized of all archaeological finds, because only they can tell us how fast those children were growing up.
If we look at the pattern of eruption of the teeth, the Skladina child, by modern standards, should be about 11 or 12 years old. The second molar is almost completely erupted. But when we look at the internal structures of the enamel and dentine, it has been shown that it's in fact much younger. We know that this child died around 8 years old.
Although the boy from Skladina would have looked like us, he probably grew up much more quickly. That means he had much less time for brain development and learning. But is it safe to assume the Neanderthals were less intelligent than we are? The crucial evidence comes from skulls. This is a digitized 3D image of our own skull, with its characteristic high dome. By contrast, the Neanderthal skull is low and elongated, possibly indicating a different brain shape. The parts of the Neanderthal brain, called the parietal and temporal lobes, may have been slightly smaller. That small difference could have had a large impact on their mental ability.
There are regions of the parietal lobes and the temporal lobes that are very important in cognition, particularly in terms of language, in memory, in remembering spatial locations.
The reduced size of those regions of Neanderthal brains might be a sign of limited thinking powers. And it was here, about 200,000 years ago, that the skulls of a new species start to be found. The last human to evolve, Homo sapiens. They are still not completely us. Their brow ridges are a little heavier, their faces a little bigger, and their technology is still simple.
If you have stone tools made by Neanderthals and stone tools made by Homo sapiens, and they're identical, you can't tell which one made the stone tools because they're making the same kinds of tools.
Our ancestors were forced to seek refuge on coasts and highlands.
It looks like 4 to 6 potential locations in Africa that would still be supportive of hunter-gatherer populations.
Despite the refuges, there is evidence our ancestors were pushed to the brink of extinction.
The genetic record shows us that all modern humans are descended from a small population of approximately 600 breeding individuals.
There's disagreement about the numbers and timing, but it does seem that all people on Earth are descended from a very small original population in Africa. Curtis Marion, our ancestors occupied these caves for over 140,000 years, leaving behind an amazing record of their transformation.
This site documents a change in the way that people made stone tools. At the bottom of the sequence, they made stone tools with this rough quartzite material, and then right at about 71,000 years ago, which occurs just about there in the sequence, they make a shift to making stone tools on this silkcrete in the form of long, thin blades. Before flaking it, the people here were heating this material in the fire, and through heating it, improved its flakeability. And that was at about 71,000 years ago. About 40,000 years older than that has been found anywhere else in the world.
For me, what is really important is here, for the first time, really ever, we have evidence that people can store information outside of the human brain.
It is the birth of a new type of human culture. More complex, but easier to pass on from generation to generation. "60,000 years ago, our ancestors emerged with new technology and new culture. Thousands of years of drought had forced them to change. They were ready to explore the world. As the climate improved, they started to stream out of Africa. They might have been surprised to discover continents already populated by other humans, remnants of earlier, more primitive migrations. As they moved into Asia, they might have come across Homo erectus or the tiny hobbit. There's no evidence for such a meeting, but there is one encounter we can be more certain about. As a separate wave slowly moved through the Middle East into Europe, they must have met the Neanderthals. What were those meetings like? For many years, scientists speculated that early Homo sapiens populations absorbed the Neanderthals through interbreeding. If they did, there would be traces of Neanderthal DNA in our genes today. But there was no way to detect Neanderthal DNA until researchers at the Max Planck Institute set out on a daring scientific odyssey: the quest to sequence the Neanderthal genome. The human genome contains approximately 3 billion chemical bases, the A's, T's, C's, and G's that make up our genomes. Mapping that was hard enough. The idea of mapping the genome of a long extinct species seemed pure fantasy. But that didn't stop Svante Pääbo from dreaming about it. The first problem was to get DNA from Neanderthal bones over 30,000 years old. In most cases, DNA degrades steadily over time, leaving only minute fragments.
My group is involved since over 20 years now in developing techniques to retrieve ancient DNA from fossils and old bones, because always a dream was to do the Neanderthal, our closest relative.
But finally, taking great care not to contaminate it with their own, they isolated the first piece of Neanderthal DNA. Svante's dream is now a reality. He and his team have made a draft of the entire Neanderthal genome. Now scientists all over the world can compare key parts of it to the human genome. And one such comparison is already giving us deeper insight into the Neanderthal brain, the gene called FOXP2.
It's the only gene we know of today that's involved in speech and language development in humans. We know that because if one copy is lost in a human due to a mutation, we have a severe speech problem.
When first discovered, FOXP2 created a lot of excitement. Although many animals have the FOXP2 gene, the human version is unique. Some thought it was the gene for language. We now know that complex traits like language are controlled by many genes. Yet researchers agree the human version of FOXP2 is closely tied to some of the basic motor skills necessary for speech.
And the big question was, of course, is that shared with Neanderthals or not? And when we now look at it in the Neanderthal, indeed, it looks to be identical with us.
It's tantalizing evidence that despite their mental limitations, the boy from Skladina and his people may have been able to speak. If we share the capacity for language with the Neanderthals, could we both have inherited it from the same source? A common ancestor who gave rise to both species. Who was it? With a technique called the molecular clock, scientists can now find out. That's because DNA mutates or changes at a surprisingly regular rate. By counting the differences in the genetic code of Neanderthals and ourselves, simply comparing the A's, T's, C's, and G's in our DNA, scientists can calculate how long the two species have been diverging.
We can then estimate when there was a common ancestral population, where some individuals went on to become modern humans, some went on to become Neanderthals. It's in the order of, say, 300,000, 400,000 years ago.
The timing points straight to the intriguing ancestors who left Africa 500,000 years ago and buried their dead in the hills of northern Spain, leaving a distinctive pink hand axe at the spot. This is Homo heidelbergensis, who we now know is our ancestor too. In Europe, they evolved into the Neanderthal. In Africa, groups that had not yet migrated evolved into Homo sapiens. So DNA is revealing we share a common ancestor with the Neanderthals. That trend, already established in Africa, would become more pronounced as our ancestors spread around the world. Archaeologists have been able to track their movements by the extinctions of large animals. In Europe and Asia, the arrival of Homo sapiens coincides with the disappearance of the hairy mammoth, the cave lion, and other large mammals. In Australia, most animals weighing over 100 pounds vanish within a few thousand years of our arrival.
The effects of Homo sapiens on large animal communities become more profound as you move further and further from Africa. So very few major extinctions in Africa, a few extinctions associated with Homo sapiens moving into Eurasia. And then when they hit Australia and the New World, it's a wipeout.
The Neanderthals were just one of many species that disappeared when we arrived. Gradually, they were pushed into marginal areas of Europe. Their last refuge seems to have been the Rock of Gibraltar 28,000 years ago. Then, they vanished, leaving no legacy but their fossilized bones. For the first time, there was only one type of human on the planet. The ways in which cultural evolution and genetic evolution interact will be at the forefront of the research of tomorrow. Because one thing is for sure, evolution